Montana, 2025. They told the archaeological team that what lay inside the sealed wooden crate was just an ordinary farm tool, nothing worth getting excited about. In a way, they were right. Only, that discovery ended up becoming the biggest shock the museum's metallurgy lab had ever recorded. In the cold, quiet storage vault beneath the basement of the Montana State Museum, the crate was opened under the watchful eyes of 3 experts. The faded yellow lining cloth was pulled aside, and for the first time in over a century, the axe head forged in 1891 by the blacksmith, ridiculed by the entire town, Eamon Blackwell, came into view. Dr. Howard, who had examined hundreds of frontier-era metal artifacts, stood silent for 10 seconds before speaking. The metal he was looking at bore no resemblance to something that had endured 134 Montana winters outdoors. "This axe head hasn't aged," he said softly. They knew full well that if it truly was hand-forged iron from the late 19th century, it should be pitted with rust, deeply corroded like others from the same era. But before them, the surface was smooth, black, stable, as if time had simply overlooked it. Another expert placed a modern steel axe head right beside it, one they had brought for comparison, 2 years old and already covered in rust and cracks. The contrast silenced the entire room. Finally, Howard looked up, gazing at the 2 objects separated by more than a century, yet speaking to a single paradox. How could a man considered a fool, using techniques 700 years old, create something that even modern science struggles to explain? Memories of Eamon Blackwell don't begin in the glow of the forge fire, but with the smell of cold smoke and the sound of metal snapping on a winter morning in the small, late 193 century town of Cold Ridge. He was only 12 when he watched his father, a careful Irish blacksmith of renown, collapse right in front of the forge door. The cause wasn't inexperience or carelessness, but an industrial steel pickaxe head freshly purchased from a factory in Helena that snapped in 2 while he was swinging with full force. The shattered steel flew into an artery, and the otherwise healthy man died within minutes, right in front of his son. That was the day Eamon learned a lesson he would never forget. Iron is supposed to protect human life, not take it. From that moment, the pain and the sense of betrayal by the metal hailed as progress became a deep scar in his mind. As he grew up, while America rushed headlong into industrialization, Eamon went the opposite way. He turned back to the techniques passed down by his father, ones he believed weren't outdated, but simply never properly understood. But Cold Ridge, with its miners and ranchers enamored of new machinery, offered him no such patience. They laughed every time they saw him digging bog ore instead of buying mill-rolled steel. "Old-world nonsense," they said when they watched him pile clay and stone to build a medieval-style forge. "Nobody needs medieval tricks," they mocked as they saw him grind each piece of raw iron with the focus of a man in prayer. "Bloomery boy," the town kids shouted whenever he walked past. But the insults didn't make him quit. They only deepened his resolve. Eamon began working in silence, during hours when no one was watching. At dawn, while dew still clung to the grass. Late at night, when the whole town slept and only the sound of his bellows echoed like a quiet declaration. He believed that iron, if truly understood, would never betray a person, and his father had died because of steel made too fast, too cheap, too hastily. In that solitude, he formed the conviction he would follow all his life. Not everything modern is better, and not everything old is obsolete. There are things time never wears away, among them the truth he was determined to prove, even if the entire town turned its back on him. After the early years of ridicule and isolation, Eamon entered a phase that experts would later call the deepest recorded period of self-taught metallurgy by a frontier blacksmith. It all began with his father's old trunk inside where yellowed diary pages recording failed experiments, scribbled notes describing the heat of charcoal fires in impoverished Ireland, and observations about bog ore that his father had called the metal of survivors. Eamon read them every night by oil lamp, tracing each faded letter as if conversing with the father he'd lost. He didn't stop there. He sought out ancient metallurgy books, brought over by Irish immigrants, many, with torn covers and nearly faded text, yet still containing marvelous descriptions of medieval iron, swords and axe heads that had survived centuries without breaking. He even found a 13th century handwritten copy describing how European blacksmiths watched the breath lines of iron when it glowed red hot, and how they drew impurities into thin strands like wood grain. That knowledge, seemingly out of place in an industrializing Montana, opened a door for him that no one else could see. Armed with it, Eamon began experimenting with dozens of ore types from the Bitterroot Range. Some days he brought back blood-red iron ore, others porous black ore from the foothills, so light people thought it was just hard rock. But the ore that obsessed him most was bog ore, what all of Coldridge dismissed as Earth's trash, damp, foul-smelling, and leaving black mud on the hands that was hard to wash off. Townsfolk called him crazy for digging it, but Eamon saw what they didn't: phosphorus. Phosphorus was the key element in the ancient Irish ores his father had described as metal that protects itself. While everyone else used modern steel because it was cheap and fast, Eamon spent every day studying how modern steel rusted. He watched rust layers eat deep into newly bought axe heads, seeing them develop like tunnels running along the metal structure, pushing oxygen grains deeper, destroying internal bonds. He examined each crack under a magnifying glass and wondered why steel was pierced from the inside so quickly. To answer that question, he turned an old, drafty wooden shed into a laboratory. On rough wooden shelves, he arranged metal samples: a piece of commercial steel, a rough forged piece of Bitterroot ore, a preliminarily smelted piece of bog ore. Day after day, he exposed them to moisture, sprayed mist, placed them in different environments to observe how rust spread. In his notebook, each sample received meticulous notes: rust depth by week, spread direction, color change speed. The pages grew thick with sketches of slag fibers running through iron, impurity patterns that seemed ugly but, through his eyes, looked like tiny glass walls, blocking rust from penetrating deeper. At night, when mountain wind rattled the shed roof and made the oil lamp flicker, Eamon knelt beside the clay furnace he'd built himself, roasting handfuls of ore to feel the changes in the metal structure. Every crackle, every spark, every small surface change was recorded. He had no laboratory, no modern chemistry knowledge, but he had something more valuable: patience and pain transformed into will. The turning point came one winter night when he realized what the ancient texts hinted at, but never stated directly: impurities, the very things the modern world saw as the enemy of metal, could become its protective armor. Phosphorus formed a durable film. Slag fibers redirected rust. Stable patina blocked deep oxygen penetration. Eamon closed the notebook, looked at the glowing iron mass in the furnace, and whispered, as if speaking to his father, "It's them, not perfection, that saves iron from betraying people." From that moment, he knew he had found a path no one else saw one he was willing to follow to the end, even if the whole town opposed him. Once he understood the path clearly, Eamon made a decision that left all of Coldridge stunned. He built a bloomery, a 12th century European-style smelting furnace right in the small town square where people usually gathered to trade goods. A clay and stone tube furnace, not even shoulder-high to an adult, looked so crude that children thought it was a joke. The adults were less forgiving. "That mud pipe will collapse before it even gets hot," a miner shouted as he watched Eamon mix clay. "Just buy steel like everyone else. What's the point of building that ancient junk?" the general store owner said, shaking her head. Anyone passing by offered mockery, and each laugh weighed heavier on the shoulders of a man already accustomed to solitude. But he kept going, hands gripping the wooden trowel tightly, eyes never leaving the emerging shape of the furnace. Difficulties began right from the first test firing. Mountain winds blew so hard they ruined the furnace in an hour, scattering the still wet clay as if trying to uproot his resolve from the ground. The second time, once the furnace was built and he tried to raise the heat with wood charcoal, he discovered his charcoal supply was nowhere near enough for the required temperature. The fire burned weakly. The ore only glowed faintly, then died. The third time, when he thought he had everything under control, Montana temperatures suddenly plunged, freezing the bog ore he'd collected into heavy metal mud blocks that were hard to handle, as if nature itself sided with his mockers. Still, every night Eamon returned to the furnace alone, bowing before the flickering orange glow that swallowed his shadow. The dancing light clearly illuminated the harsh lines on his face, but in his eyes the determined gaze never faded. He believed in what he was doing, even when the whole world didn't. One late winter evening, after nearly 6 straight hours maintaining heat using only bellows and patience, The first bloom appeared. When Eamon pulled it out with iron tongs, the whole space filled with red glow like a beating metal heart. It wasn't beautiful, wasn't perfect, just a spongy iron mass full of impurities. But to him, it was life. It was proof that the path he'd chosen wasn't delusion. He placed the bloom on the anvil, and the first hammer blows rang out in the freezing night, each one reaffirming his resolve. Each strike elongated the slag inclusions, turning them from crude lumps into thin fibers running evenly through the metal like wood grain in an ancient tree trunk. They would be the tiny walls protecting the iron from rust invasion. Eamon knew that, even if no one else yet understood, and on the night the first bloom was forged into the first pieces of usable iron, he understood that every insult, every hardship, every collapsed furnace or frozen ore had been necessary trials before iron revealed its true soul. Word of Eamon's first bloom spread slowly, like lingering warmth in cooled ashes, until one day a farmer named Michael Tate decided to come see him. Tate was practical, not much for believing in ancient iron stories, but he was also desperate after 3 brand-new steel axes rusted and chipped in just one season of woodcutting. That day, Tate stood at the forge door, twisting his wool cap in his hands, awkwardly saying he wanted to borrow an axe head Eamon had forged experimentally. Eamon didn't say much. He simply handed Tate the axe head tempered with bog ore and hammered thousands of times, one he'd never dared sell, keeping only as a personal test. "Just use it the way you always do," Eamon said quietly. Tate took it, unsure how to react. 3 weeks later, on a morning blanketed in snow and thick valley clouds, Tate returned to Cold Ridge. People saw him walking so fast he nearly tripped on the step outside the forge. Eamon was stacking charcoal when Tate burst through the door, breath coming in white puffs. In his hand was the axe head, clean, black, with a soft sheen like mountain stone polished by time. "It didn't rust," Tate said, almost whispering in disbelief. 3 weeks of rain and snow. Not a single mark, not one spot. He turned the axe head under the thin light coming through the window, rotating every angle so everyone in the shop, 2 passing customers, and the apprentice boy could see. The metal surface was strangely stable, as if created to defy Montana weather. Murmurs began, then spread through the streets like gusts blowing snow off rooftops. From person to person, the story grew. The axe head didn't rust, didn't chip, was even sharper than many steel tools Tate had used. That afternoon, when Eamon went to the well to pump water, he heard a group of men talking, call him by a new name. No longer Bloomery Boy, no longer the town joke. Iron Keeper. They said to each other, the keeper of Iron's soul. Eamon stood still for a long time, water overflowing the bucket unnoticed, not out of pride, but because for the first time in years, the silence surrounding him had been replaced by something else. Acknowledgement. Not loud, not extravagant, but enough to kindle a new fire in the heart of a blacksmith who had carried too much pain. Every hammer blow he'd ever swung, every night spent beside the fragile clay furnace, every mocking word had finally found an answer. And that was only the beginning. From the moment Tate returned with the unrusted axe head, Eamon knew it was time to create the finished version of what he had pursued for half his life. He called it the Blackwell Mark IV, not to show off, but to remember the 3 earlier versions that had failed or only reached acceptable. Mark IV would be the culmination of everything he'd learned from his father's diaries, ancient metallurgy books, and his own obsession with iron that never betrayed people. He began with tempering the stage he saw as making the iron remember its purpose. Under golden firelight, Eamon heated the blade until the surface turned pale straw yellow, then let it cool just enough before raising the heat to produce deep copper, finally the faint blue he called the color of endurance. Those colors flowed across the metal like waves of light, each shade corresponding to a new structure forming inside the iron. Next came quenching the real test. Instead of plunging into cold water as blacksmiths of the time usually did, Eamon immersed the axe head in a pre-prepared mixture of salt water and linseed oil. Steam exploded upward, linseed oil clinging to the metal to form a thin, stable, glossy film. He listened to the long hiss, the sound he considered the sign that the iron was locking its internal structure, like a warrior tightening armor before battle. After tempering, he moved to the final step, seasoning. This was the part Eamon performed most slowly. He reheated the axe head to a faint red, then rubbed linseed oil in steady spirals, layer after thin layer. The hot oil polymerized on the surface, forming a smooth, dark, protective skin that gleamed deep black like mountain stone. Under the firelight, the Mark IV axe head was no longer just a tool. It seemed born from the fusion of time, earth, fire, and human will. The first people Eamon lent them to immediately noticed the difference. The axe head stayed sharp, even cutting hard wood. The surface didn't discolor even left out in night dew. The balanced weight made labor noticeably easier. Gradually, his tools appeared all over Coldridge, in barns, on wagons, at ranches, and mining sites. People began bringing stories they themselves could hardly believe. Axes that didn't chip, even hitting stone-dead trees. Picks that didn't oxidize, even forgotten in rain for 2 weeks. Machetes that stayed shiny through long winters. Compared to industrial steel that discolored in days and cracked in months, Eamon's tools seemed from another era, durable, loyal, and so unreasonable that people had to look twice to believe it. No one said it aloud, but deep down in this small town, people began to acknowledge that the man once called Bloomery Boy had created something that transcended every limit they'd believed immutable. And from then on, Coldridge would never be the same. Yet that quiet glory truly burst forth when the greatest disaster in Coldridge history struck. January 1893, the Montana sky turned lead gray, clouds hanging so low they seemed ready to sweep rooftops. That night, wind came first, a kind that whistled through wooden walls like a sharp blade. Then snow fell, not in soft flakes but heavy slabs pounding the ground like falling stones. In less than 48 hours, the storm became a blizzard no one had ever seen, snow deep to a man's waist, hail hammering wooden posts until they cracked, and temperature swings from deep freeze to near melting that caused commercial steel throughout town to warp and split. Industrial steel axe heads left on porches turned deep orange overnight, rust eating deep tunnels. Wood saws lost teeth in chunks. Door hinges rattled by wind gusts shattered in sudden cold snaps. Fences blown down by wind. Metal chains turned brittle as glass. Coldridge residents quickly realized that without dry firewood and solid barns, they wouldn't survive the storm. But when they tried to chop wood, their steel axes broke. When they dug paths for livestock, picks and shovels rusted in hours. Axes bought new, the previous season, were now little more than scrap. Chaos filled the valley. Men ran from ranch to ranch searching for tools, but every tool was broken or rusted beyond use. Women tried to stock more wood in stoves, but supplies ran low because no one had usable tools to cut fresh. Livestock bellowing under the snow turned the town into a place besieged by nature itself. And then, in that chaos, people began to remember Eamon Blackwell. An old man blurted out, "The things he forges, they never seem to rust." The word spread faster than the storm winds. Only when desperation peaked did groups of people, families who had once mocked him, one by one knock on the door of the small forge on the hillside. They stood shivering, voices faltering. "Eamon, do you have anything we can use?" Eamon didn't ask questions, didn't reproach, didn't remind them of the mockery they'd heaped on him. He simply went to a large chest in the corner, one he'd quietly prepared over many years, filled with spare tools forged using the very techniques they'd called madness. Axe heads, picks, hammers, crowbars, all bearing the stable black patina, gleaming in the forge light. He handed one to each person, telling them to wipe off snow after each use, but not to worry about rust. An old miner, the one who had mocked him most, held a Blackwell Mark IV axe head and trembled. "My God, it's still warm, like it's alive." As they left, clutching tools they knew could save their families' lives, Eamon simply stood watching the blizzard pound the town square. Within that storm, the sound of his hammer seemed to echo somewhere, proof that sometimes the past isn't weaker than the present, it's only slower to be understood. And as that night passed, storytellers would record a line that became legend in Coldridge. In the storm strong enough to destroy steel, only Eamon Blackwell's medieval iron stood firm. When the blizzard finally retreated, leaving behind a devastated but still living Coldridge, residents began to realize what they had never dared admit. Without the tools Eamon forged, many families would not have survived that harsh, long night. The Blackwell Mark IV axe heads remained sharp, their patina unchanged even after lying in snow for hours. His picks, crowbars, and saw blades were the only ones that didn't break or rust, and thus became the pillars that helped the entire town withstand nature. At the first town meeting after the storm, the little church on the hill was packed. Everyone looked exhausted from sleepless nights. But in their eyes was something new. Deep respect for the man once seen as eccentric. The mayor of Coldridge stood, surveyed the room, then paused at the row where Eamon sat alone, hands still blackened with soot from this morning's forging. "We're still here," he said, voice ringing clear. "In large part because of Eamon Blackwell. Without the tools he spent years forging, we couldn't have kept our roofs, our barns, or our very lives." The room fell silent for several seconds, then applause broke out, first scattered, then thunderous enough to shake the wooden walls. Some men came forward to shake his hand. Several women bowed in thanks. Children looked at him with admiration, as if seeing a figure step out of an ancient tale. News of the strange event, a frontier town saved by medieval forged tools, spread so fast that soon a reporter from Wyoming arrived, notebook and curious gaze in hand. He examined the Blackwell tools, heard the story from many witnesses, then wrote a widely read article titled, "The Man Who Forged the Past to Protect Our Future." When the article was published, people began pouring into Cold Ridge to see the indestructible implements for themselves. But while the town and even the surrounding region now saw him as a symbol, Eamon remained unbelievably humble. When asked how he felt, he only smiled, eyes sad yet bright. The old ways were never wrong. We just stopped listening. That statement silenced everyone around him because they understood the man before them hadn't just forged iron. He had reforged an entire community's perception as it raced toward modernity without understanding the cost. And from that day on, Cold Ridge no longer mocked him. They called him by the name the blizzard had etched into history, Iron Keeper. A century passed since the winter of 1893. Cold Ridge changed, people changed, but Eamon Blackwell's tools quietly endured in grain bins, sheds, old wooden boxes that no one really noticed. Only in 2025, when the archaeological team and metallurgists from the Montana State Museum conducted the Frontier Metalworks Reconstruction Project, did they accidentally open a door back into the world Eamon had lived in. The Blackwell Mark IV axehead, the item that saved the entire town, was brought into a modern metallurgy analysis lab. When laser light scanned the surface, the screen displayed the internal fiber structure, and the entire team fell silent. Slag stringers ran lengthwise through the metal like thousands of ultra-thin glass fibers, about 20% denser than medieval European standards. No one understood how a blacksmith, living in late 9th century Montana, with no lab, no measuring instruments, no chemistry knowledge, could create such a sophisticated structure. When they ran compositional analysis, they found the phosphorus concentration fell exactly in the sweet spot. A ratio modern science confirms can create a natural anti-rust layer, allowing the metal surface to form a protective film that blocks oxygen penetration. Not too much, not too little, just enough to prevent rust without making the metal brittle. This couldn't be coincidence. Next was patina analysis. Under an electron microscope, the magnetite layer coating the Mark IV was so stable that researchers concluded it had developed during early use, then frozen into a near-perfect state. No red rust, no deep corrosion, no layering signs. That patina wasn't the product of stable time, it was the result of a technique formed right from forging, as if the armor was put on the moment the Mark IV touched hot linseed oil. When analyzing crystal structure, they discovered non-uniform carbon distribution, a rare feature in industrial metallurgy, because modern steel is optimized for homogeneity. But here, that non-uniformity provided advantage. Carbon-rich zones gave the edge hardness, while low-carbon zones made the body tough and impact-resistant. A self-balancing system, one that today's mass-production steel mills struggle to replicate. When the final report was completed, the lead researcher said only one sentence, later quoted in dozens of scientific papers. Blackwell recreated medieval metallurgy from scratch. Not by luck, by obsession. Comparing the Mark IV to modern steel, scientists found stark differences. Industrial steel rusts quickly because its uniform structure allows rust to spread along unobstructed tunnels. Mass production processes remove all beneficial impurities, phosphorus is stripped, slag completely eliminated, making the metal strong when new but significantly weaker under harsh weather. They also noted that the primary goal of the modern steel industry is speed and low cost, not generational durability. Thus, today's steel lacks a natural immune system, the term the research team used to describe the defense mechanism that Eamon-style hand-forged iron possesses inherently. A young researcher said at the press conference, "We can't call Eamon Blackwell a man of the past. With what he did, he was at least a century ahead of his time." And in that moment, Coleridge didn't just regain a legend. The modern world, for the first time, bowed before an ordinary blacksmith who lived and died unaware that what he created would astonish science 100 years later. When the final analysis of the Mark IV was published widely, what surprised people wasn't just the metal structure or enduring rust resistance, but the philosophy hidden behind them, something modern scientists had to admit they had long forgotten. A metallurgist at a symposium at the University of Montana said bluntly, voice low but resonant, "What makes Blackwell's iron endure isn't perfection, but the very flaws that modern industry was too quick to eliminate." He pointed to the microscope image of the Mark IV, where thin black slag fibers like hairs ran through the steel crystal matrix. "We call these impurities. Blackwell saw them as armor, and time proved him right." The remark silenced the auditorium. People began to understand that 20th century optimization, speed, productivity, absolute standardization not only made steel weaker, it also stripped away something essential, the ability to accept imperfection that carries lasting strength. Another expert, studying natural rust and patina mechanisms, looked into the camera and asked a question that later went viral on social media. "In our rush to make everything faster, cheaper, more convenient, what have we lost?" That question wasn't just about metallurgy. It was about modern America itself. About buying something knowing it will break in 2 years. About replacing a phone every 2 months, even though the old one still works fine. About choosing cheap over value. About mistaking speed for progress. "Do the most durable things always come from perfection?" the professor continued. "Or do they come from harmony between weaknesses and strengths like Blackwell's iron?" Many who watched that lecture said they felt exposed in their own consumer habits. Disposable products, furniture replaced every season, tools that rust so fast it's considered normal. Consumerism, the lifestyle of consumption, had made Americans accept short lifespan as the default standard. In that context, the Mark IV became a symbol not only of ancient technique, but of an idea. Things made slowly, carefully, with the right impurities last longer than those produced perfectly and quickly on assembly lines. One journalist wrote, "We live in an age of absolute cleanliness, iron without impurities, processes without error, products without roughness. But by removing all roughness, we also remove the ability to endure long-term." Looking at the Mark IV, we don't just see an axe head. We see a philosophy resisting the frantic pace of life. Sometimes the right path isn't the fastest or most perfect, but the one that leaves room for traces of life, slag fibers, phosphorus layers, patinas that seem ugly but protect metal in storms. And in that moment, Americans began to understand Eamon Blackwell in a completely new way. He didn't just save Cold Ridge in 1893. He left a lesson for a whole world frantically seeking perfection while forgetting something more important, sustainability. And then the story, like a quiet circle closing, brings us back to the Montana Museum, where the Blackwell Mark IV axe head lies peacefully in a thick glass case, golden lights shining on the smooth black surface, making it look nothing like an object that has lived over a century. It doesn't demand attention, doesn't boast its age, just lies there as a silent witness to time, to human hands, and to a philosophy the world had nearly forgotten then rediscovered. The experts stand around the case, discussing with the reverence usually reserved for ancient relics. One researcher, who followed the project for 3 years, leans down to examine the axe head for a long time, then quietly says a line repeated dozens of times in conferences. He didn't create tools. He created time. And in that moment, listeners finally understand that what remains isn't just metal. It's the mark of a mind daring to oppose its era, daring to believe in the past when the whole world chased the future. The storyteller, standing between two eras, can only acknowledge a simple yet profound truth that touches deep within everyone. Sometimes the last thing people discover is what they once mocked. The jeering words that once followed Eamon Blackwell like a shadow, old-world nonsense. Bloomery boy. Now ring as a wake-up call for an entire society that accepts rusty steel as standard. Because every time we open the garage door and see a tool bought 2 years ago already covered in orange streaks, we don't just feel annoyed at the breakdown. We unwittingly remember a man who spent his whole life proving that steel doesn't have to die so quickly. Every time we throw a rusted item in the trash, we're also throwing away a chance to ask, why do modern things decay faster than something forged by old hands 130 years ago? And more importantly, what has the world traded for speed? Before the Blackwell axe head, we don't just see a product of the past, we see a reminder that some old things aren't worth forgetting techniques, philosophies, values that time cannot fade but only makes shine clearer. The future isn't always ahead. Sometimes it lies in lessons the past tried to teach but we refuse to hear. And so, if you believe some ancient things still hold power to shape today's world, if you feel that part of sustainability lies in what is slow, meticulous, and true to its nature, stay with us. Subscribe. We have many more stories to unearth, many secrets buried under the dust of time, stories not just about metal, but about how humans relearn endurance. Thank you for following to the end of the story if you found value. Please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next journeys of discovery. See you in the next video.